You are an experience. Make sure you're a good experience. Now, go have fun!
There's two popular theories of gender that tend to be prominent in the more trans-inclusive feminist spaces. The first is Judith Butler's gender as a performance. The idea that gender isn't simply something that you are, but that you do, and in doing a gender, you effectively become it. It's a little more nuanced than the gender-critical equation of gender with gender role, and generally less judgmental. The second, and one more popular with trans people themselves, is gender as an identity. I identify as. You're a woman because you identify as one. The very act of proclaiming oneself to be thing makes you thing. That gender is simply a self-declaration. This one is also contested by trans people because of the idea that cis people get to have a gender, whereas trans people only get to have a gender identity. This one is still pretty fuzzy, and in general the idea of self-declaring oneself, there's a lot of self there, as a particular gender is fairly core in a lot of trans thinking. So much so, in fact, it was one of the things that people dragged up as a receipt during the recent ContraPoints controversy, which I'll unfortunately be talking about a little bit in this video, as it's what sparked this train of thought. Some of ContraPoint's ideas about gender are a little controversial, though generally somewhat misinterpreted. The most interesting idea to me that she put forward was in an earlier video of hers, which asked the famous philosophical question, what is a chair? Is a giant statue of a chair too big to sit on a chair? Or something you can sit on but looks nothing like what you traditionally think of when you hear the word chair, like a bunch of blocks stacked together? I plan on going into more detail on this in my eventual TERF video, which I'm probably going to keep plugging for future prosperity in many videos until I finally make it. Hopefully not too many. But the point that's important to introduce here is that a lot of the way we define these concepts is kind of fuzzy. This is one of the reasons why TERFs are outright wrong on a lot of things, because making such impossibly aggressive absolutist claims about how gender depression works cannot possibly match up with reality. There is always too much feathering around the edges. Sex, in of itself, isn't discretely binary with a few exceptions that apparently don't matter, because screw intersex people, I guess, but comes from what's known as a binomial distribution. In other words, while there aren't simply two sexes or two genders, there are two peaks that roughly correspond to our more conservative notions of sex, falling off into the blurry area of variance that is the reality of modern biology. So this presents us with an interesting concept. The idea that something both manifests itself in a more concrete reality, the idea we very definitely tend towards the two sexes, but also the large amount of cases that bleed off the edges, with border cases that are hard to call. It's a strange duality between the objective and subjective, and gender tends to follow suit. Most people are binary identified, but increasingly many people are not. These are both objective realities that sometimes clash. In my last video, I dealt with the idea of simulacra, a representation of something so far removed from the original as to barely resemble it. Gender is a curious case where it could be considered a simulacrum, which the gender critical and, to a lesser extent, Judith Butler gender as a performance crowd would plump for. But there's also clearly a more concrete layer to it. So how can something so real and unreal exist as itself simultaneously? That gives me a headache. Honestly, it's something I've been trying to figure out as a largely binary trans person who feels a bit more queer around the edges than a traditional transsexual. This is a problem explored in the idea of map-territory relation. In Sylvia and Bruno Concluded, Lewis Carroll came up with the idea of a map that had a one-to-one scale with the country it was supposed to represent. Due to practical difficulties, this idea was scrapped, and one character says, we now use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you it does nearly as well. So, should we throw away the maps we have of gender? Or should we just make them so big as to match some notion of material reality, covering every nook and cranny of the gendered human experience? Or have we been trying to use the country all along? There's a logical fallacy known as Loki's wager. You can look it up for the finer details, but basically it's about being able to distinguish the limits of one system as it bleeds into another. If a Loki is to have their head cut off, where does the head begin and the neck ends? It's a sort of purposefully obfuscatory tool trying to get off on a technicality. Of course we know which part of the head is and which part the neck is. It's common sense. But is it? Another similar thought process comes in the form of the ship of Theseus, a ship kept in a museum which has each part replaced over the years to maintain it. At what point does it stop becoming the original ship? If we view gender and sex as something less singular and more complex, an archetype roughly possessing multiple qualities, at what point does it become something different as we swap those cis parts out for trans equivalents? I think maybe we need to shift our focus a bit. A lot of rhetoric in modern social justice focuses on the idea of lived experience, most commonly associated with standpoint theory. This sounds fancy, but basically it's just a theory of social justice that focuses on the perspective of the person directly affected by an issue. Because modern trans thinking is a little bit dismissive of brain studies and very dismissive of the transmedicalist angle, I identify as is often seen as the source of a given gender to begin with, like I said earlier. So for those of us for whom this doesn't sit well, what's the alternative to gender as an identity or gender as a performance? Allow me to present to you a miraculous product you've probably yet to hear about, gender as an experience. So, when we take someone on their word for something, for example, self-reporting symptoms that might be necessary for a diagnosis such as fibromyalgia or really a whole host of things, or when we take the word of an abuse victim that they were abused, it is not merely identifying as having experienced these things that makes them a person who experiences these things. But it flags the idea that most likely they are indeed that sort of person. It's the same with sexuality. While people are free to choose the exact individual label they use, you won't really get someone who is functionally straight self-reporting themselves as gay. People self-ID as gay or bi or pan, but it's not simply a team you pick, unless you're a political lesbian. And I feel like at one point our understanding of being trans was a bit more the same. It's something you feel, something that affects you in 1,000 subtle ways every day. It's something substantive, but difficult to qualify to an outsider, and even more difficult to quantify. Almost but not quite in the realm of qualia. The fact that we pick up some generalized brain differences in people of different sexuality or gender identity means these things do manifest to some degree in a more physical way, even if we're not entirely sure how or where. So it's not quite as subjective, for example, as what you see the color red as. But ultimately, it is a subjective experience to each of us. I find myself relating to female and sometimes non-binary characters considerably more than male ones. Not that there aren't male characters I can relate to, but I feel like I can get in the mindset of, or somehow resonate more with a female character for reasons that are difficult to describe. This is really one of the big things that drags me back whenever I think I'm not really a woman, at least not until I have all the bits done and live most of my life as one. There is a reason why being a man, even virtually, can make me feel uncomfortable. Though I do play plenty of Lucio in Overwatch, because he's the best boy. Boop! Why are you so angry? Whether or not that's enough to qualify me as one, there's something there that goes beyond mere identity. And it's very easy to write this off solely as dysphoria, that seeing myself in a male frame of reference is triggering in some fashion. But I point to the concept of gender euphoria and link that to the idea that, well, often playing as male characters isn't really uncomfortable for me, just somehow less ideal. The fact that we can have strong negative and positive feelings in the characters we relate to suggests a deeper experience. We relate to female or feminine tropes more than masculine ones, or a mix of the two, or neither. Which, when thinking about this frame of reference, is really difficult given what you have to work with is so heavily gendered, so more non-binary and gender non-conforming representation, please. There's a lot I could say about the connection between a person and their avatar in terms of gender or other signifiers that I'll cover in a later video most likely. But using this as an example, you can probably see what I'm getting at. This is also why trans women overall tend to be more feminine and trans men overall tend to be more masculine in presentation. Though we're challenging that more and more nowadays. If you look at my last video though, that's not always for good reasons. This gets us accused of upholding sexist stereotypes, though it's a very damned if you do situation, because if we're in any way masculine, we get a lot of hate that looks very curiously like misogyny from TERFs. But obviously I'm mistaken and the brainworms are preventing me from seeing the deeper truth here. Even if maxi dresses and makeup don't make a woman, and shirts and short hair make a man, or bow ties make an MB, these are still things which are essentially tropes associated with those things. While some of these tropes can potentially be harmful and reductive, again, see last video for some examples, ultimately it's a mimetic language of sorts that allows us to express a more complex inner experience. And we express that experience by signifying an archetype or set of tropes we relate to. And this can help flag those things to other people, because even if we have an understanding of gender that goes beyond these signifiers, and that may be on a level or even greater than radical feminists, other people don't necessarily get that, and to alleviate dysphoria or to just function properly, we do often need to play ball to some degree, which sucks, but it's a thing. Basically, cis people get away with being gender non-conforming a lot easier than we do because we are so heavily policed for our gender. So in a sense, we do pick a team, though not simply out of a vague preference, but out of a sense of identity, belonging, and some sort of shared experience. The concept of shared womanhood, of course, is controversial, and something I'll get into when I finally do my TERF lambasting video, and generally something upheld by white global north feminists. But again, as a looser archetype, as a set of interconnected tropes, it holds up a bit better. Again, I refer you back to the ContraPoints video on gender and the what is a chair problem. Of course, there's the problem of male socialization, or the reverse, and trans women, for example, sharing quite different experiences to cis women in terms of how their anatomy affects expectations. But again, these aren't technically universal, and TERFs will often abuse things that happen to women in much poorer and more exploited countries to prove a point, despite them often having very different cultural expectations to theirs. So even if trans women are maybe in some ways at the edges of womanhood, I'm doing air quotes here, so too are plenty of other women relative to other women. The definition of woman is ultimately more useful if it includes trans women, not just for trans women but other women, as trying to cut out a definition that only includes assigned female at birth women can be problematic on a number of levels, including a racial one. Most trans people grow up with some inkling of something being off. Not all of us play with dolls from a young age or such stereotypical things, but we're often outcasts and we tend to spend much of our time internally relating to girls rather than boys, but suppressing that. Of course, this isn't the case of trans women, and I should have qualified that I am mostly speaking from my own experience, so apologies if it is a bit trans femme centric. Because of this, our gendered experience is unlike that of cisgender boys. Our experience is neither that of a typical assigned male or female at birth individual. It's unique. But its uniqueness is derived from our proximity to femaleness, not maleness. We experience a connection to it, a subconscious wish to be able to do it over as one of the girls or to be one of the girls. The truth is that these things are so complicated, often the only easy way to do things is to use straight up self-identification. This is why the OG, original gender man, Magnus Hirschfeld, said that the only way to know someone's gender for sure was to ask them. Of course, we don't always self-report this correctly. People can live in denial or in the closet, even from themselves, for years and years and years. But in the modern day and age, eventually, most of us tend to. Though this is another reason for gender being an experience rather than simply an identifier. People who never quite manage to ID as being trans openly, but still relate to a concept of, for example, being non-binary, not quite feeling comfortable with either gender, still have an internal experience that's distinct from men and women. This is also why even apparently binary identified trans people, but especially non-binary people, will often post seemingly abstract made-up genders, like goblin or goose or Fruit Loops, or post "this is my gender" in response to a picture of an iguana holding a sword, because gender is weird. It's less of a spectrum and more of a ball of wibbly wobbly, Jeremy Beremy gender fluid. Let me put it in a nerdy way for you nerdy nerd people. Since we've established that you're a huge nerd, a high-tier geek mind with 12 levels in Hackerman, you've probably heard of a hash table. A hash table contains a key, which we'll say in this case is a phrase like landshark. We want to link this key or identifier to a value stored in what's called a linked list or array. So, if one person calls out Landshark and someone else calls out 36, like it's a game of Baldur's Gate bingo, we can do something with that. So when we look up the Landshark, we know he has 36 cheese strings, another quality gender, whereas the flail snail has 12. Now, to associate one of our beasties with the number of cheese strings it possesses, we need a function for doing that, in this case called, funny enough, a hash function, which is not a formal weed smonking event. The hash function does some magic math on your landshark to make it all mathematical and links it with a value in a way that can be easily retrieved. It decides where its corresponding value should be placed in the array, and thusly also knows how to retrieve it. So what does this mean? Well, landshark is the gender we identify as that points to a value, or in our case, a much more complicated conceptual experience. In order to understand the connection between the two, we need something weird and complicated like a hash function or, well, the concept of gender. While gendercrit types relate gender as being a purely oppressive construct, in a wider sense, it can be a way in which we associate with a myriad of values or ideas that are often associated with a label. I realize I've done a terrible job of explaining this, but I feel like the general idea is too good, so I'll just hope I suddenly become popular enough for someone to explain this better in the comments section. When we think of gender, when we conceive of gender and men and women and non-binary people, we don't tend to think of reproductive organs or phenotypes or solely of archetypal 50s housewives and Mad Men salary bros. Rather, we have a much more, well, fluid understanding of gender. In other words, not only is our own gender an experience, but the concept of gender in general, or that of other people, is an experience. The same goes for attraction, and this is the reason why talking about trans attraction is such a problem. Because attraction isn't some mathematical fact, but again, a wibbly-wobbly experience that can depend on multiple things. The idea of someone not being attracted to someone they'd otherwise be attracted to because they have or once had a particularly shaped organ can often be suspect for this reason. It's not something you're actively experiencing when you look at that person, so rather it's often born from an external source, a societal prejudice or what have you. Of course, you might not find that organ attractive or want to interact with it, but that's not the point. It's that your experience, your subjective attraction, is suddenly becoming nullified based on a detail you don't generally perceive. After all, people can experience attraction towards two-dimensional characters with no actual genitalia at all. So, to close out on the real meat of this problem, we need to address the big issue with reducing being trans to purely self-identification versus experience. It makes it too easy to nullify or treat as a conditional. Someone identifying as something makes it sound like an action other people can choose to respect, or not, a simple preference. It's a weaker statement than outright declaring oneself as something, or more importantly, as experiencing something. It's easy for TERFs and transphobes to focus on the idea of gender as a simple function of self-identification, someone just saying something. Comparable to stating an opinion because, and this is important, it helps obfuscate the actual experiences behind that identity. Trans people don't just identify as a man, woman, or MB, they experience a bunch of things that others with those labels, be they cis or trans, tend to experience, as well as unique things that people under the trans label tend to experience as well. I've had a similar experience with being a Muslim convert. Because of the fact that I'm a white convert in particular, it's made a lot of people, and this is in leftist groups' mind, like LeftTube posting, feel emboldened in their Islamophobia. Because to them, it is a simple self-declaration, and there are no experiences behind it. Nobody cares about what it was like to come to terms with it, or what it's like to be alienated by others because of it, because it's simply an identity I can flick on and off at any time. In other words, saying I identify as makes you seem like you're in a particular fandom or like a particular thing. Instead, saying I am this, I've gone through this, is a lot more concrete and hard to ignore. Cis men don't experience the sort of leering and exotification that both cis and trans women do, for example. So while that experience may be subjective in essence, as in relative to the person, it's still objective that these things tend to happen to these sorts of people more than others. The focus on identity, especially in the debates surrounding self-declaration, fails to highlight this. TERFs in particular will gladly completely erase the lived experiences of trans women to pretend we're exactly the same demographically as cis men. That's a lot easier to do when the only barrier is self-declared identity, and why we need other hooks to ground their gender in something less contestable. Although ultimately it is about identity, but about rooting identity in something more concrete than simple self-identification. Even where self-identification is more likely to be the root of said identity, there's still going to be consequences for that, and that's something we're chronicling and discussing. I feel like we had a better understanding of transness and gender beginning to form at some point, but the identity is everything meme took over. So I'm going to propose the idea that identity as a qualifier isn't everything. What it is a pointer to an experience or set of experiences. Identity isn't an empty signifier, but is made up of meaningful experiences and positions relative to those of others. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I would really like if you could like, comment, subscribe, the usual YouTuber shiz, because I'm not doing so well in terms of the algorithms, and I don't have a Patreon yet, but I do have a PayPal Me where you can support my work in the community and other stuff I do. And I would super appreciate that, or just linking other people to this video, or anything you can do to get us out here. I feel like there's been a lot of discourse about this recently, and some disconnect between some older trans femmes and younger trans people. And maybe this can sort of start a conversation reconciling the two. So until next time, salam alaikum, and have a wonderful day.